generals, officers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here. It's the second time. I was there 2 years ago in the then second conference on air power. So after yesterday's fascinating discussions conducted by the chiefs of some of the most powerful air forces in the world, today might conceivably seem like an anticlimax. We do face an unequal struggle, the speakers today, but we'll do our best. So, when dealing with... Okay. Now, please excuse me for reiterating the very basics, the very basic definitions, but I want to make sure that everybody here we're on a common ground today, at least as far as this presentation is concerned. So, deterrence is something very simple, maintenance of status quo by threat of force, not by the use of force. Coercion, normally the term compellence is used, but coercion will also do, is the change of status quo by threat of force. Now, what a small or a weak state is. Power is relative, as you all know, so to classify a state as small or as weak, it has to be small or weak compared to its main adversary. This will justify the inclusion of 80 million Iran in the discussion that will follow. So, Israel is a rather peculiar case because it's extraordinarily powerful through the very efficient use of limited resources, but still it's a small state. At least yesterday, the chief of the Israeli Air Force admitted as much. Let's move on. Now, the guidelines of the present presentation will be provided by these two terms. Counterforce. Counterforce is when you use your armed forces against the enemy armed forces. This is a term that emanated from nuclear strategy. You use your nuclear missiles to target the enemy nuclear missile. So this is counterforce. Countervalue, when you use your armed forces to strike at everything else. Civilian infrastructure, urban centers, industry, commerce, everything else but the armed forces. We will use 3 contemporary examples to show how deterrence and coercion can be used by small states in order to further their political objectives. So I will focus on the operational objective of 3 air forces, and I will also include the surface-to-surface missiles in the discussion. Air power, as Billy Mitchell had defined it, is anything that flies. So some people may be surprised to see surface-to-surface missiles lumped together with an air force, but as was pointed out yesterday as well, we have many elements of air power, and these are not necessarily confined to air forces. So missile power will also be used in the same context as classical air power. We can draw a continuum beginning from pure counter value, more or less pure, which is the case of Iran, and ranging to full counterforce, which is the case of Greece. By the way, how much time do I have? Something like 20 minutes, General? Okay. So, from more or less pure counter value to more or less pure counterforce, with Israel being somewhere in between, and I will show what I mean. Let's start with Iran. During the Shah's time, Iran was trying to build something like the 3rd or the 4th biggest air force in the world. After the Islamic Revolution, this is basically gone. They do have some serviceable aircraft. I have the numbers with me, but I don't want to burden you right now at the presentation. I will leave it for the Q&A session should the need arise. So anyway, they have something like overall more than 300 fighters, but a relatively small percentage of them are serviceable, and many of them have probably been cannibalized to keep the rest going. They do use, or they may use, these aircraft in order to disrupt the oil shipments in the Persian Gulf. So this is, once again, a pure counter-value option. But basically, for all intents and purposes, the Iranian Air Force is not really dependent on aircraft. It is dependent on ballistic missiles. Already since the 1980s, Iran started investing in ballistic missiles, acquiring the Scud B and C, rename it with Persian names, and then keeping on trying to acquire longer range missiles. The jewel of their crown is the so-called Sajil, which is somewhere in the range of 2,000 kilometers, although it might be plagued by some technical problems. Anyway, so the Iranians say we don't need to invest on expensive aircraft and expensive pilots because those Americans and Israelis have the bad habit of shooting them down. Better invest on ballistic missiles. The problem is that if you have a conventional warhead, a ballistic missile has limited payload and even more limited accuracy. So they cannot really be used as counterforce weapons. And even mass cannot compensate, especially in a tactical context. So they do use massive salvos in order to saturate their defenses, but overall these ballistic missiles cannot have any meaningful counterforce role. So basically Iran has been forced to invest on counter value. In other words, we have those missiles and we will try to strike at enemy cities, at enemy industry, at enemy infrastructure. And as I said before, this is not economical to do with a conventional payload, with a conventional warhead. So that's why Iran started its nuclear program. Now, I do not think that the Iranians were actually bent on acquiring nuclear weapons. They were, in all probability, trying to cultivate what is known as nuclear option. In order to acquire a nuclear weapon, you need an X number of years. Nuclear option is when you move on with your program and you reach the point of X minus 1. That is, you can have nuclear weapons, you can acquire nuclear weapons within a year. Iran has more or less achieved that. So it's okay with the book of the Iranians. They will say, whenever we want, we can acquire those nuclear weapons, nobody can stop us. We don't actually need them right now. So we will get rid of those annoying sanctions. So to summarize, Iran, being a small state compared to its main strategic adversary, which is still the United States, and a lesser one is Israel, has been forced to completely abandon or almost completely abandon counterforce options and invest on counter value. Either try to disrupt the oil shipments in the Persian Gulf or try to be able to acquire the capability of hitting enemy cities and enemy civilian infrastructure. So this is the case with Iran. And in my humble opinion, it can provide some useful lessons that I will share with you shortly. What about this one? Any idea of how to move this? Trying it. Okay. I've been trying every trick in the book and somehow it doesn't work. Okay. Let's move on to Israel. Until 1973 inclusive, until the Yom Kippur War, Israel was the Israeli Air Force was a purely counterforce force. This was until 1973. However, as the time went by, Israel was also forced to increase its counter-value capabilities. This happened for two reasons. The first one was the acquisition of nuclear weapons. Now, this has never been officially admitted, but Israel is widely believed to possess a nuclear arsenal. Estimates vary up to 200 warheads. So nuclear weapons, especially those delivered by aircraft, cannot really be used for counterforce purposes. Basically, you blow up the enemy cities. So once again, it's the quintessential counter-value weapon. So this is one of the reasons why Israel has been investing more to counter-value than to counter-force. Now, the second reason is the evolution of the threat that Israel faces. You may recall yesterday the chief of the Israeli Air Force, did he refer to any conventional threat at all? No. Did he refer, let's say, to Egyptian or Syrian divisions? No, I didn't hear anything about that. So the threat has evolved. It's basically unconventional. Now, this has created peculiar problems for Israel because in the past, when they were threatened by Arab states, everything those states did had a return address, as the Israelis like to say. The Israelis could always retaliate against Egyptian or Egypt or Syria, per se. But now, if a splinter group from Fatah or Hamas attacks you, whom do you attack? Or, in order to avoid the attack, whom do you try to deter? So the threat has evolved, and it's also another reason why they have to invest in counter-value capabilities is that it is increasingly difficult to distinguish between counter-force and counter-value in an unconventional setting. You may recall yesterday in the presentation of the Israeli general that it is very hard to distinguish it. You just hit an apartment block and it happens to be a Hamas compound or something like that. But also there are also people living there. So it's very difficult to distinguish. Third, in the context of the threat evolution that Israel faces, Iraq, Syria in the past, Iran, as I said, possibly, they were trying to acquire nuclear weapons. So how did Israel respond in the case of Iraq and Syria? With counter-value strikes. They struck the nuclear reactors. So all these reasons have been forced Israel to invest on both strategies, both counter-force and counter-value. That's why I put it somewhere in between Iran and Greece in the continuum, between counter-value and counter-force. So you see, different strategic context, different answer. In order to, but once again, the objective is the same, enhance your deterrence. The Israelis are giving a different answer than the one given by the Iranians, but it seems to be working as well. Okay, let's see now, let's come to the case of Greece. And my presentation here will be rather more extensive than in the previous two. Once again, I repeat though that I am very glad to clarify everything, to elaborate during the Q&A section regarding Iran and Israel. Air Sea Command. The importance of the Aegean theater is vital as far as the Greek military strategy is concerned. Now, the key is to make geography work for you. Because if you have a very narrow land point of view, then you would see that geography is very disadvantageous as far as Greece is concerned. Greece is something like a gamma, an inverted L shape, with plenty of islands to the east. So these are conceivably very vulnerable. On the other hand, if you also include the maritime environment and you also put the Navy in the picture as well, then you could see that Greece is a quadrilateral. So the key is to ensure as much as possible maritime control. Okay, now I'm here in an Air Force environment, so I will leave the Navy aside for the time being. But you get the idea. The thing is that if you combine all the elements of all three branches, you can create an enormous firepower environment that will make it prohibitive for any potential adversary to try to enter the Aegean. Now, of course, there are many imponderables, many other parameters to discuss, but this is the basic strategic idea, and it has been very, very well defined in the mission of the Air Force. Air control, as much as possible. So, If you manage to do this, then geography all of a sudden becomes an advantage. All of a sudden becomes an advantage because a potential strategic adversary must overcome an inimical, a hostile Aegean Sea in order to strike at crucial targets at the Greek mainland. So, how do you do this? Greece is perforce compelled to invest in quality. It is very rare for Greek armed forces, and especially the Air Force, to be quantitatively superior. So how do we compensate for this? Quality. On the other hand, we also have to monitor quantity, because we cannot allow a potential strategic adversary to increase the gap too much. There was Colonel Olsen yesterday launched an attack, I'm joking, on Clausewitz. But, okay, Clausewitz have got quite a few things right. And he insisted that after a certain point, numerical superiority can crush everything. So this is the idea. And by the way, this is what Israel is doing as well. They may accept numerical inferiority, let's say vis-a-vis Egypt, but it's not exactly a strategic adversary at the moment. But they are also very careful not to fall below a certain level. You need to retain a critical mass. And this is what Greece is also doing. Once again, I have the numbers with me. I will not bother with you right now, and many of you know those numbers better than me. So, but this is the idea. You invest in quality while monitoring quantity. Counter-value option. I said Greece is doing counterforce, trying to assert air control, but for the time being, suppose in the future, suppose, I'm not saying this is about to happen, but suppose that there appears a strategic adversary who is far more numerous and in at least some respects, even qualitatively superior. What do you do? Can you do counterforce? You lose. Iran might conceivably give some ideas. Sometimes a counter-value option might be the only deterrent option. You will not win the war. For instance, 2 years ago when I heard some similar ideas, the then chief of the Hellenic Tactical Air Force and now chief of the Hellenic General Staff, unfortunately he's not here with us today, he asked me this question. If an adversary has a powerful war machine and you suggest that we somehow avoid dealing with it, can we really win a war? The answer is no, we cannot. But the idea is to deter the war, to threaten to inflict so much damage that even if a potential strategic adversary wins the war, then the game will not be worth a candle. As simple as that. I repeat, we're not, and I don't expect us to be in the position of Iran vis-a-vis the United States anytime soon, but it's not bad to have some lessons in mind and to keep our options open and to think outside the box and all the things that you like to say. So, conceivably in the future, Greece might think it advisable to acquire at least some counter-value options. Now, a small assessment, a brief assessment of the success of current Greek deterrence strategy. Basically, Greece does deter a general war. Greek deterrence is working very well in this respect. We do deter an all-out war. However, we do not deter, so far we have failed to deter low-intensity threats. This is a problem. Could be a very long discussion on that, but I hear some very pessimistic views. Oh, we have no deterrence, or the other side, the completely the other end of the spectrum. Oh, we are very powerful deterrent force. Well, the truth is somewhere in between. We do deter a general war. We do not deter low-intensity threats. So overall, Greek deterrence strategy is basically a sound strategy. Overall, it is working. However, in the future, it might conceivably need modifications. As General Christodoulou told us yesterday, we're trying to find, we've run out of money, we're thinking now. So we're finding ingenious solutions to achieve more with less. And hopefully we'll overcome the present crisis and things will be back to normal. But should this not happen anytime soon, we should keep our minds open. This is my admonition. To conclude, what all these cases show. To start with, they show the amazing strategic inventiveness of human beings. And the experience of human beings is very, very similar along the millennia and across the world. I like to quote Thucydides, who said, okay, don't you think that people are very different from one another? So you could see that strategic inventiveness has been shown in all three cases by all these relatively small states. I also want to point out that successful deterrence, as I hope has been showed by the previous discussion, successful deterrence can be essential to the well-being, the territorial integrity, and even the sheer survival of a small state. And air power is often the key to successful deterrence. Thank you.